I invite you to join me for a word of prayer. O Lord, open thou our hearts to hear, and through thy word to us draw near. Let us thy word heir pure retain. Let us thy children and heirs remain.
Amen.
I want to introduce you to two brothers today. Two brothers who are always together. They always seemed to do everything together. They were never apart. Two brothers that grew up in a small community near a lake. It was a safe place. They had the run of the place. They knew every inch of the waterfront. These brothers would go down there fishing regularly. They would swim together. When they grew up, these brothers worked together. They both went into the family business, working with their father. I'd say working for their father, except these brothers had an independent streak. They didn't always do what their father wanted them to do. They might have worked with him, but didn't work well for him. In fact, there was one day when they were working with their father, and it was middle of the day. And they still had a lot of work to do, and yet someone came up and caught their attention, and they walked off the job and left their father to finish it for him and his hired hands. You see, they're the owner's kids. And so they thought they gave them a little bit of privilege, and that had gone to their heads, these two. In fact, the day they walked off the job and left their father to finish it on his own with the hired hands, well, that's the day they walked off the job for good. They never went back. They left the job together. They worked for him together. They left together. These brothers did everything together. They even came to believe in Jesus at the same time, long before their parents knew him to be the Savior. Let me introduce you to James and John. Or if you're from the little backwater Galilean town, village that they were from on the north side of the Sea of Galilee, you might have known them better as the Sons of Thunder. And a lot of people gain that nickname when they're kids. That's a nickname that somebody gives to them and stays with them through their growing up years. Although this nickname didn't come when they were kids. This nickname was given to them not until after they met Jesus. Jesus actually gave them that name. And perhaps Jesus gives them this name because there was a time when Jesus and his followers were headed to Jerusalem, and they were going to go down through Samaria to get there. And so Jesus sent some of his followers ahead of him to go ahead and make arrangements in one of the Samaritan villages so that the rest could come and they'd all have a place to stay when they arrived. Except that this Samaritan village didn't want to host them, because they were all Jewish, and because they were passing through Samaria and going to Jerusalem, a Jewish city. And so they didn't want them to come stay there. And so James and John, these two brothers, go up to Jesus and said to him, "Lord, do you want us to call down fire from heaven and consume them?" The heat of that moment earned a stern rebuke from Jesus, recorded in Luke chapter 9, verse 55. Because Jesus didn't come to condemn people, and he wasn't going to Jerusalem to condemn people. Simply sent his followers to a different Samaritan village. And whether it was just on account of that one incident or these furious eruptions became a regular pattern for James and John. And Jesus gives them the name Boanerges, which in their backwater Galilean Creole dialect mix between Hebrew and Aramaic means something like sons of thunder. And these two sons of thunder are making noise again in the text that we're going to focus on for today. The text that we're going to focus on is the gospel lesson. It's from Mark chapter 10. You have it in your service folder beginning on page 3 and going over to page 4. I'd like to just start at the bottom of page 3. Mark chapter 10, verse 35 is where they begin to make noise again. Because these two brothers come up to Jesus and they say to him, now get this. I mean, listen, this is what they say to him. "Teacher, we want you to do for us whatever we ask of you." Really? "Teacher, we want you to do for us whatever we ask of you." These are the two brothers who came to Jesus and said, "Let us call out fire from heaven and consume that old village full of innocent people for lack of hospitality." And here they're asking, "Lord, we want you to do for us whatever we ask of you," before they even tell him what it is. And I'm not Jesus. I can't see into people's hearts. I can't judge their motives the way he can, but I think I'd be rather cautious, knowing these two, of responding to any request that they would bring, or let alone even letting them finish the request. And yet Jesus tells them, name it. What is it you want me to do for you? He's got more careers than I. What is it you want me to do for you? And they say to him, grant us to sit, one at your right and one at your left, in your glory. Now before we go any further, let me tell you what this is like. This is like booking the economy rates at the hotel, but then when you get there and arrive, you tell the clerk you want to be upgraded for free to the presidential suite. I mean, this is like getting hired on as a temporary employee and then being disappointed because you expected you were going to be given the corner office with wraparound windows and views of the city. And this is like you're eating your tomato soup at the restaurant and it's cold, and you complain to the waiter and demand that they give you lobster tails and steak to replace it. That's what this is like. These guys are not just impetuous and tempestuous. These guys are presumptuous. And not only are they presumptuous, but then when the other disciples hear about it, then the thunder really starts in. That's when things get noisy. Because in verse 41, it says that when the 10 heard about it, they began to be indignant with James and John. Well, that's a way to summarize it. Mark's just kind of capturing that real quickly for us. But you can imagine that the lightning and thunder was about to fly in words between these 12 disciples over what James and John did, had not Jesus calmed the storm in verse 42. But before we get to what Jesus said in verse 42 to calm the storm, let's go back to what Jesus said to James and John before the others really realized what was going on. Jesus said to James and John, "You do not know what you were asking." You do not know what you're asking. Did they know what they were asking? Well, no. Jesus just said they didn't know what they're asking. But what did they think they were asking? What did they think? Well, let's go back through some of the things we know about these two brothers. We know that these two brothers thought of themselves as kind of having a privileged place in society. Maybe they were from some backwater villages on the north side of the Sea of Galilee, but they were prominent people in that community because their father owned his own business, had his own fishing business, and he actually had hired people that worked for him, and they were sons of the owner. And so they kind of carried that prestige around with them. So that's Mark chapter 1, verses 19 to 20. We find out about that. We also know that their influence went beyond just those little villages of Capernaum and Bethsaida on the north side of the Sea of Galilee, because these are two of the only disciples out of all the 12 who are actually known to the high priest of Israel in Jerusalem. And in fact, known so well to him, and whether that's by family connections or business networks, or we don't know, but they had enough influence that one of these, John, was able to actually walk into the guarded courtyard where Jesus was being tried when he was on trial before the high priest, and he was let in because he was known to the high priest. And so he walked right in. But not only that, he had enough influence in that sphere that he went over and told the servant girl who was guarding the door that she should let his friend Peter sneak in as well. And she did it. So these were two who liked to wield their influence and their position of privilege. We also learn, that's in John chapter 8, around verse 15 to 16. But we also learn that they're mama's boys. So not only do they like to wield the sort of influence that they have because they're the owner's sons of the fishing business, but they're mama's boys. And so even though they're grown up, they're not sort of having any problems with having their mom do their talking for them. And we know that because of the recording of this incident in Matthew's gospel. Matthew, one of the 10 who was indignant over James and John because of what they did here, records the same incident, and he tells us a little bit more about how this came about, because it's actually the mother of James and John who came to Jesus first off and brought up the topic and asked for these places of privilege for her son. So that's in Matthew chapter 20. And look around verse 20, you'll find it there. And we also realize that they're used to having this sort of place of privilege around the disciples, too. They're used to being in the inner circle and being privy to things that the other disciples don't get to see or to know. And so in the previous chapter, Mark chapter 9, Jesus takes these two disciples with him, along with one other, Peter, and takes them up into a high mountain and begins to reveal something to them that no one else has seen and no one else has ever seen on earth. He shows them the fullness of his glory, and while he is shining before them in divine light, and they get a glimpse, a window into heaven for a moment, there at his right and at his left, they see the Old Testament prophets, Moses and Elijah, standing next to him. Which means that when they came to Jesus here in this text of chapter 10 and asked Jesus, grant us to sit, one at your right and one at your left in his kingdom, it's not because they presumed that those seats were somehow empty and unoccupied. They knew who was sitting in those seats, some of the greatest prophets that ever walked the face of the earth. And yet in their mama's boy, sons of privilege, owners, sons kind of get what we want kind of way, they asked Jesus for those seats for themselves anyway. Did they know what they were asking? No. They didn't know what they were asking. Well, what did they think they were asking? But they thought they were asking to have a prophet's place. Give us the place of Moses. Give us the place of Elijah. Give us that place next to you in your glory when you really show it for everybody to see. We want to be there. But Jesus knew they didn't know what they were talking about. So Jesus said, are you able to drink the cup that I'm about to drink? Are you able to be baptized with the baptism with which I am to be baptized? And they said to him, we are. Whew. Their confidence is just brimming over, and they don't even know what they're talking about. They're able to drink that cup. They think they're asking Jesus for a position of power, for a position of authority, for a position as judge, where they can lord it over other people like they wanted to do with that Samaritan village. But that's not why Jesus came. And Jesus had just got done telling these 12 that. And that's the beginning of the text in Mark chapter 10, beginning at verse 32. Jesus said to them, see, we are going up to Jerusalem. And the Son of Man is going to be delivered over to the chief priests and the scribes. And they will condemn him to death. And they will deliver him over to the Gentiles. And they will beat him and mock him and spit on him, flog him, and kill him. And on the third day he will rise. Jesus did not come into this world. His earthly ministry was not about power. It was not about wielding worldly authority over people. It was not what they thought it was about. And that's what Jesus goes on to explain to them in verse 42 when he speaks to all of them when the thunder and the lightning is about to fly in the argument between them. He said to them, for the rulers of the Gentiles lord it over them, and their great ones exercise authority over them. But it shall not be so among you. For whoever wants to be great among you must be your servant. And whoever wants to be first must be the slave of all. For even the Son of Man, talking about himself, did not come into the world in order to be served, but to serve and to give his life as a ransom for many. That's verses 42 through 45, the end of our lesson. Jesus' words to those disciples. Let me introduce you to two brothers. These two brothers were separated far too soon. These two brothers were paragons of peaceful resistance. You thought that Mahatma Gandhi and Leo Tolstoy and Martin Luther King Jr. were the fathers of passive, nonviolent resistance. No, these guys were being arrested for sit-ins and peaceful resistance 2,000 years before those 21st century figures were even born. These guys were arrested, they were beaten, one of the brothers, even executed for his faith and his witness. Because one of them was the first of Jesus' disciples to be executed for his faith and witness to Jesus. And the other one, while he was the longest lived of all of Jesus' disciples, went on to write more books of the New Testament than any other of Jesus' 12 disciples. And yet he suffered for his faith on account of it too. In many ways, spent the last years of his life alone on a deserted island in exile because of his faith and witness to Jesus. And this was that witness. It's immortalized in the words that he left behind. He said, beloved, let us love one another. For love is from God. Whoever loves has been born of God and knows God. 1 John chapter 4, verse 7. And this is what he said about love. By this we know love, that he laid down his life for us, and we also ought to lay down our life for our brothers. 1 John chapter 3, verse 16. And you'd think maybe he's talking about his brother there who was martyred for his faith, but he's not first and foremost talking about his brother who was martyred, but he's talking about the pattern his brother was following, and that was the pattern of Christ Jesus. And this is what he went on to say about Christ Jesus. He said, he did not come into the world to condemn the world, but that the world might be saved through him. John 3, verse 17. Let me introduce you to two brothers. let me introduce you to James and John. And these are the same two brothers that I introduced you to at the beginning of the sermon. Does it sound surprising to you that the sons of thunder would become sons of the gospel? I mean, is it surprising to you that these two brothers, who were so impetuous and presumptuous and these privileged, would soon become those who were paradigms of living in the way of self-sacrifice, of putting others first, of leading with loving service, and of walking in the way of the cross? How could that be? How could it be? Because when they asked Jesus for what they asked him that day, and he said, "Are you willing to drink the cup that I am to drink? Are you able to be baptized with the baptism that I am to be baptized by?" And they said, "Yes, we are." Jesus gave them what they asked for. Now, even though they didn't know what that meant. And they thought it meant one thing, but what it really meant was the end of themselves. What it really meant was the end of their cocky and thunderous attitudes. What it really meant was the end of their pursuit of power and prestige and authority and fun and fame and whatever else they might have been seeking in this world. And what it meant was that they would, from now on, be walking in the way of the cross. The cross of Jesus Christ. It meant that they would be following him and in his footsteps, because Jesus was about to do for them what they could have never imagined at the moment. Jesus was about to give his life for them. And one of those two was the only of Jesus' disciples, of the 12, to be there to the bitter end, at the foot of Jesus' cross. And that was John. And this is what he wrote about it. He said, "This is love, that he, God, sent his only Son to be the atoning sacrifice for our sin." Whose sin? His own sin and the sin of his brother. He wrote that, 1 John chapter 4, verse 10. And he was the sacrifice for his sin. And his brother went on to walk in that way of the cross and became the first of Jesus' disciples to give his life for faith in Jesus. He gave his life at the hand or command of King Herod, who was the same king Jesus stood trial before. And he gave his life as Herod ran him through with a sword. By his command for sure, maybe even by Herod's own hand. And John, who witnessed that too, in addition to Jesus' death, went on to say this. He said, "Whoever says that he remains in him, in Jesus, ought to walk in the same way in which he walked." 1 John chapter 2, verse 6. Whoever says that he remains, abides in Jesus, ought to walk in the same way in which he walked. What way is that Jesus walked? Jesus walked in the way of service. The Son of Man came not to be served, but to serve, and to give his life as a ransom for many. And that is the pattern that not just for James and John when Jesus tamed their thunder, but that is the pattern for everybody who says they abide in Jesus. For everybody who's a follower of Jesus. And that's why Jesus said, "It will not be so among you. For the one who would be great among you must be your servant. And the one who would be first must be the slave of all." And so, dear Christ follower in the pew, are you ready to drink that cup? Are you ready to sit in that seat? Are you ready to be baptized with that baptism? Earlier in the sermon, I described the impetuousness and presumptuousness of James and John like an employee who's sort of temporary but expects to get the big corner office with the wraparound windows. Well, a couple weeks ago, one of our Bible studies, a Thursday morning men's group, one of the men shared a story that happened to him in his workplace, and he gave me permission to share it with you today. He had been working for years at this company, had been made a manager, and so he was beginning to have other people work under him and be in charge of projects. And up until that time, he had always worked out of a cubicle, and everybody that was working for him was working out of cubicles as well, except when they gave him this project that was going to stretch for multiple months. They knew it was going to be significant, and so they cleared out an office for him and gave him office space so that he would be able to have meetings in private and lay out the plans for the project and those sorts of things. Well, one major initiative and project rolled into another multi-month project, which rolled into another multi-month project, and before long, he had been in this office for a period of years. And then the projects were kind of wrapping up and getting to the point where things were kind of calming down. He was in a lull. Not that he didn't have enough work to do. He still had plenty of full-time work to do, but he wasn't having to put in the extra hours in the evenings and the weekends like he had before. He hadn't been given another major initiative yet. But there was a newer manager, somebody who had worked underneath him, who was being assigned with a significant new task to accomplish. Only there was no more office space available in their department. And so he went to the newer manager and said, you know what, I don't need this office anymore. Why don't you take this office? I'll go back to working at the cubicle. He said, you wouldn't believe the stir that created in the office. Because the people who knew what he did came to him and said, why would you give up your office? Are you crazy? You'll never get an office again. And if you just kept your office, you would have had it forever. This was your office. Why would you give that up? And the people who didn't know what had happened were stopping by his cubicle. And they were noticing him in there, and they were coming by to express their sympathies and maybe stand in solidarity with him against the company because they thought the company was somehow demoting him or disciplining him for putting him in that cubicle again. And he said, no, they didn't do anything to me. The company's great. I gave up my office voluntarily. When Jesus tames our thunder, the way he did for James and John, it creates a stir when other people hear about what's going on. But it doesn't create a storm. You see, when James and John acted in their impetuousness and their presumptuousness, it created a storm. And it was a storm of indignation and jealousy and competition all around it when others heard what was going on. But when we live in the way of servanthood and lead with loving service, the way Jesus calls us to do, it doesn't create a storm. Not of indignation and competition. It creates a stir. And the stir is when other people hear about it, and it causes them to ask the question, why would you do that? What's different about you? And Peter, good friend of James and John, fellow apostle, reminds us that's just what God wants. And here's what he says we should do at that time. 1 Peter 3:15. In your heart set apart, Jesus Christ is Lord, and always be ready to give reason to anyone who asks you for the hope that you have. Do this with gentleness and respect. So, are you ready to drink from that cup? To sit in that seat? To be baptized with that baptism? As Jesus said to James and John, you will. In Jesus' name.